Let me stop you right there, Chief. It's not we as a people, it's the political elites, it's the politicians. This whole notion that in a democracy we are the state, that's absurd. The state is its own separate organization. The individuals in charge of the state have their own goals, their own set of beliefs, their own motivations. Just because every 4 years you put a rubber stamp on one of two identical candidates brought to you by the duopoly does not mean that we are in charge of the government, that we are making those decisions. So, no, it doesn't have to go to war. However, there's a very strong incentive, especially in the executive branch, to go to war. And I mean, if you look at the 20th century, America has been waging war pretty much nonstop on every tiny little defenseless nation that crossed their radar, from Grenada and Nicaragua to Yemen, Iraq, Iran, the people of Palestine. They bombed a Clinton bombed a an aspirin factory in the Sudan on the basis of some extremely shaky evidence, possibly because he wanted to distract from the Monica Lewinsky scandal. To say nothing of covert operations and the propping up or installing of tyrants around the world.
Allow to happen.
Well, I mean, I'm not necessarily. Are you allowing the war that or the stuff that's going on in Iran and Iraq right now to happen? Or are you allowing that?
Well, no, but I'm also not allowing stock buybacks either, and that's happening. I mean, the
And what, pray tell, is your problem with stock buybacks? Look, if a company makes some profit and there's owners of the company looking to sell their shares at a certain price, and the manager or CEO of the company decides to buy up some of the stock that's or some of the stock that's outstanding on the market that's looking to sell and consolidating the ownership a little bit, that's a perfectly fine use of company funds. There might be some tax advantages to increasing the value of outstanding stock versus paying a dividend, but that's not a problem. There's nothing nefarious going on here. It's just economic illiteracy on the part of the left that assume anytime a big company does anything, it's a conspiracy to screw over the little guy. When in reality, these are perfectly benign market mechanisms. Sometimes companies need more funds, so they sell off a part of the company in the form of shares. Sometimes the opposite happens. What's the big deal?
Stop buyback.
what's wrong with stock buybacks? It well,
I don't know. There's fucking nothing wrong with them, I guess. I'm just a dumb piece of shit liberal talk show host.
it
Just spit it out, Junior!
of the stock market.
It's a manipulation. And how do you define manipulation? Is any act of buying and selling stock a manipulation? A company choosing to buy up outstanding stock is not a manipulation. It's market mechanisms. I mean, the whole point when a company makes money is that money goes to the shareholders. So, if a company buys up outstanding stock, thereby using the revenue they made to increase the value of the remaining shares, they're paying shareholders. That's what companies do. That's how the market economy works. That's the entire point the company was founded in the first place.
It is it. I mean, to the extent that it used to be illegal, so much so for.
The truth of the matter is, stock buybacks have never been illegal. He's just flat out wrong there. Now, what is illegal is manipulating your stock price. And this is the response of some legislation that was passed in the wake of the Great Depression, or rather the market crash of 1929. So, if the stock buybacks are viewed as market manipulation, then engaging in a stock buyback can make you liable for that. But the act of stock buybacking itself is not illegal per se. What happened in 1982 was Rule 10b-18, which basically just laid out the conditions under which a company could engage in stock buybacks without exposing them to the liability of violating the Security Exchange Act of 1934 prohibition against manipulating your stock prices. By the way, have you ever heard the story of Jonathan Lebed? This guy, back in the year 2000, he was a 15-year-old high school kid. And he got access to his father's brokerage account or whatever. And he would go on Yahoo Chat. I swear to God, you can look this up. Jonathan Lebed, Lebed, Yahoo Chat. And he would go, oh my God, this stock is so hype, you know? And he would post these messages. And then the stock would blow up. And he'd sell, you know, in a pump and dump scheme. 15 years old, this guy made millions of dollars by hyping stocks on Yahoo Chat. And then the SEC came and they took it all and said, go to college, kid, you know? And they took all his profits. But, like, how stupid are we as a society, as a race, you know, that some 15-year-old kid could hype up a stock on Yahoo Chat, and people with portfolios of, I guess, you know, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, they're like, yes, that's an excellent market analysis. I'm going to definitely buy this stock. He ended up paying a total of $285,000, which I guess was his profit plus the interest. They didn't fine him or make him pay a penalty. I think it's kind of a reasonable solution. You should have let him keep like 10 grand or something, you know? He used the advanced tactic of creating multiple internet handles and would send as many 500 false and misleading email messages to various Yahoo Finance message boards. We would probably refer to them as posts these days, but this was back in 2000. The internet was still new, so we can forgive the New York Times a little. He even set in auto sell orders in case he couldn't make it home in time from calculus to cash in on the sudden upswings. Wonder whatever happened to that kid. I mean, that guy is destined for greatness.
Prior to 40 years ago.
I mean, without using, you know, appeals to authority like something being legal or illegal, what's immoral about a company buying pieces of their own company back?
What's immoral about it? Well, a company only. What is a company? What defines a company?
Google says a commercial business, which seems like a self-referential definition to me. I would say a group of individuals acting in consort to engage in trade, production, and other market activities. I think Seder is sort of on the back foot here and playing for time. What's wrong with the stock buyback, Seder? Where's the immorality?
A group of people, you know, putting together and providing goods and services.
I really like this ancap guy. He seems quite on the ball.
No. What's a company? What do you need to be a company? To be incorporated.
No. Most companies are corporations, but there are other types of companies aside from corporations. You've got limited liability partnerships, you've got the sole proprietorship. So Seder is being a little smarmy here, and he's wrong on the facts as well. Still think he's just playing for time.
A government
Trying to come up with something for why stock buybacks are so terrible.
enforced thing. I mean,
Correct.
The idea of incorporation only
Correct.
exists as the legal shield
So he's just circling back to it's wrong because it's against the law?
of liability for the business owners to prevent them from having their own assets seized in the case of bankruptcy or things like that.
Correct.
A corporation is inherently government agreement. Corporations are protected by government. You remove government, corporations don't exist. You just have people.
Oh, I hate this argument. No, corporations, like, a corporation is just a type of business that has shareholders. Okay, that's a perfectly fine and legitimate thing that libertarians should be in favor of. This phobia of corporations is just uncritically adopting leftist analysis. Corporations, there's nothing wrong with them. There's also nothing wrong with limited liability. If I invest $50 in a firm, I shouldn't be on the hook for my net worth. I don't think critics of corporations really understand what a corporation is or what limited liability means. And this is an argument I hear a lot of ancaps make, and I think they're just dead wrong.
Correct.
Providing voluntary goods and services to the society.
Correct. And of course, you wouldn't have a stock market, right? I mean, how would you enforce that?
You're completely dodging the question, Seder. Artful, though. I think he's asking how you have a stock market without the state. And you could. I mean, well, the stock market's already basically private as far as I know. I mean, property norms are basically enforced by society anyway. Like, technically, the state's supposed to be the mediator, the big daddy, or whatever. But in reality, that's so seldom actually comes into play. For the most part, people just accept and live with property norms.
Of course, the contracts that are involved in a stock market.
Well, we would be getting into theoretical territory because something like this hasn't ever existed.
But what does this have to do with stock buybacks?
Could certainly provide, a dispute resolution organization, for example, if there is a demand.
What would be their source of authority?
Anyway, I'm happy to have this conversation pivot onto ancap topics. So, anytime you have a contract, you can have a dispute resolution clause. That seems to be the easier answer, as opposed to, like, what's the authority when it's not somebody that you have a business relationship. When you're taking them, basically, if there's a crime, what right do you have to bring the criminal to this private court? Why this court, in particular, when you don't have that agreement? Now, the way that Friedman views this situation is you would have dispute resolution agencies that would basically act as an intermediary on your behalf. Anytime you did have like a contract dispute, like if you bought some shares in a company from a stock exchange and they said, "No, you didn't. What are you talking about?" or something like that. Even that seems like a weird thing to happen. Obviously, it's possible, but anytime you're dealing with like a large firm, it seems unlikely they try to rip you off, especially on a smaller deal, just because they have this great reputation to protect, and it's small potatoes to them. Like, Think of it like internet poker and poker stars, you know? Sure, they could take your $50 deposit and you really have no recourse because they're based in like the Isle of Man, but they're a multi-billion-dollar corporation and their interest is in having your business over your lifetime, not scamming some random guy for a $50 poker deposit. But I guess there could be some clerical error or whatever. They insist that you never bought their stocks. It just doesn't seem like something that's likely to happen just based on my interactions with large organizations. Okay, you could say that's because I have the benefit of living under the state's benevolence. But I think more of it has to do with just the business practices of a large corporation. You know, not that they're charitable or philanthropic, but simply looking after their bottom line. They want to keep the customers happy. They want to give them what they purchased. That's what they do. That's how they become big corporations, is by having all these fair and honest transactions with all these businesses. In terms of the broader question of how does a court get its authority if they don't have the state monopoly on jurisdiction, and the answer is they would win that authority by competing with other firms on the free market. So a market court's stock and trade is their impartiality, is their setup to guarantee verdicts which are in line with societal expectations, with the common law tradition. And I guess we can taxonomize between sort of good faith disputes, or at least one where there's two parties willingly participating, and then sort of the classical bringing the wrongdoer to justice, where you need to use force to bring your criminal to justice in the court system. So in the former case, there's really no problem. Maybe both parties would post a bond to ensure enforcement at the end of adjudication. In the second system, or in the second situation where somebody's committed a criminal act against you, well, that creates a right of redress on the part of their victim or an agent acting in the victim's behalf, assuming the wrong is sufficiently odious. Then force can be used, bringing the criminal to justice, with the proviso that if the so-called criminal turns out to be innocent, then any force used in bringing them before the court would, of course, be viewed as an act of aggression, as it was against somebody who turned out to be innocent. I mean, we could go down this path all day.
The market.
The market would be the source of authority for a dispute resolution? How does that work? Like, you mean like for instance, we're going to give you, we're going to rate your bonds AAA. And why do we do that? Because we get our business from you. Everything will go perfectly. Don't worry about your derivative mortgage bonds, because we've marked them AAA.
Seder clearly getting his economic analysis from The Big Short. I'm not sure how we've pivoted from market-based adjudication, dispute resolution, to rating agencies like Moody's evaluating financial instruments. You gotta understand that movies like The Big Short are works of fiction. They have to be dramatized to keep the audience interested for 2 hours. I think companies like Moody's et al. Do a pretty good job, generally. Mistakes can be made. I mean, there's more than one rating agency, so if some rating agency is giving drastically out-of-line assessments of a particular investment, that's going to be pretty sus, don't you think? Not to mention, like, this whole scenario is a little far-fetched. You're going to bribe Moody's to overvalue your tranches, and now you got to bribe all the other companies that do rating and hope none of this comes to light. And the other thing is, it was the selling short, which is basically what the guy did in the movie, that revealed the inaccurately priced securities. I mean, if you want to go into the root cause for the housing crisis, how about these government programs to guarantee home financing to minorities that couldn't actually afford the investment in the first place? How about the easy money policies of the Fed as a result of the dot-com collapse that blew up the housing bubble, that led to these inflated values?
Great, right?
Well, that would work in the short term, certainly, but in the long term, you're going to lose trust as an organization, and people will no longer trust that rating agency to provide valid
Really?
rating.
Really?
And so a competitor can...
What are the name of the trading? What? Really? If that's the case, what are the name of the ratings agencies today? Are they?
Did Moody's drop the ball in their evaluation of the subprime tranches? Yes, but was it corporate malfeasance? Was it corruption? Or maybe these are just complicated securities and they made a mistake. Frankly, I think this whole conflict of interest analysis is a little simplistic. Moody's evaluates a ton of different financial vehicles, and their reputation is everything. That's literally what people value from them. So I don't see the incentive for anybody at Moody's to overvalue these tranches and risk the reputation of the firm. They could have easily made an error in their mathematical modeling that they used to test the security. And what, was this the only time that Moody's had been bought and sold? If they were so susceptible to grift, then why haven't we heard anything about this from them before in other investment vehicles? Maybe there were some unexpected market conditions that they didn't anticipate. I mean, who doesn't pay their mortgage, you know? Maybe they didn't realize that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were artificially pumping up the demand for housing by financing loans that were not viable. And there was a lot of institutional money looking for the next big thing. Once all the carnage of the dot-com bubble had been liquidated, a lot of investors trying to get that percentage return flooding into the housing market. Look, it's easy to play Monday morning quarterbacker and talk about all the things they should have done and how they should have known the future and oh, it's so corrupt. But if you actually look at the cold hard facts here, I think Moody's is being unfairly scapegoated for a financial crisis that is ultimately the blame of the banking system.
In 2006?
I couldn't tell you.
Well, I can tell you, they're not. And because your entire theory went out the window. Because
Simply making an assertion like your entire theory went out the window, that's not making an argument, that's just claiming victory. You'd have to be extremely stupid to be persuaded by that. Somebody saying, I win, is not an argument.
they all rated.
Like, what does the government have to do with J.D. Power and Associates?
J.D. Power and Associates is not a bond rating agency. Listen,
Well, right.
the
but
bond rating. Listen, let me tell you a little story, because I have a feeling that you're probably not old enough to remember this, and I'm not appealing to authority. I'm just telling you. Prior to 2008, when we had a massive financial crisis that caused the immiseration of millions of people, right? You'll
Yeah.
recall all the rating agencies were rating these bonds that were being sold as AAA bonds because they were so sound, that they were so sure to pay off, and they were
And what
garbage.
repercussions did they face for this fraud?
Virtually none.
Right, because the government is complicit in all.
Moody's did end up paying $864 million to the federal government and various state governments for the so-called ratings deception. But that's typical of when anything happens. The government demands a shakedown. S&P also paid a $1.37 billion fine.
The government, there was an attempt, the government, to decouple and to put restrictions on these agencies, but the corporate forces pushed back on it.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, Google, Al Franken, and bond rating agencies, and whether or not they should be.
Seder's timeline seems like confused here. Franken didn't even make it to the Senate until 2008, and his attack on the rating agencies came after the subprime crisis, perhaps as a reaction to it. Actually, the Franken regulation made a bit of sense because what was happening was companies would rating shop, especially with the introduction of Fitch. Now there were three different rating companies: S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. So companies would, and the thing was, Moody's was a bit of a harsher critic of the bonds.
Whether they or not they should be able to be paid by their clients.
Most people are paid by their clients. As I said earlier, I really don't buy this narrative of collusion between Moody's or S&P and the banks. I do think the banks would go rating shopping, which only seems natural when you've got three people evaluating. You're going to go with the one that gives you the highest grade. But as much as I see the reasoning behind the Franken legislation, co-sponsored by Bill Nelson and Charles Schumer, I think it's a dramatic overreaction. The bill would have seen, this was the Dodd-Frank Act that Franken had tried to amend. The problem with the bill was the massive government overreach. It would have seen, or rather the amendment, sorry, it would have seen the government selecting which rating agency evaluated which security, and then now instead of having market competition, you just have the government deciding which company wins and loses. And they say it'll promote competition because now they'll give the contracts to smaller companies. But then what's probably going to happen is these smaller companies will be friends of the politicians. There'll be favoritism, patronage, corruption. I like a free market economy where the government's not intervening and picking winners and losers and telling which company gets which contract. I mean, that's not capitalism. That's state planning. That's central economic planning. That's socialism. I mean, I think Franken was right to identify a problem. In particular, that companies could shop around for whichever agency would give them a higher rating. And then the other obvious problem that stems from that is that if the companies are getting paid by the banks, then they're going to have the incentive to give them the highest rating, even if it's not outright collusion. You have the danger of soft collusion, that their interests are the same, so they make decisions that work towards their interest, as people are apt to do. And I think part of the problem is that when Moody's and S&P started their evaluations, They were dealing with bonds that were fairly simple and easy to evaluate. You look at the profit and loss statements, you look at the assets, you determine, is this a risky investment or not. But over the years, as financial markets mature, the investments get more and more complex, leaving more room for error and more room for individual discretion. At the same time, we should look at barriers to entry in the credit rating market. Maybe it's not as competitive as it could be because of the SEC standing in the way of smaller firms that want to get in the business. If the SEC had never licensed and regulated credit agencies in the first place, then maybe this market wouldn't have become so oligopolistic. One of the things that happens when you impose licensure costs and regulatory restrictions on entry into a market is that established business interests prosper at the expense of potential entrants. And the Franken plan of the government sort of forcing new entrants in and assigning them business is frankly just as bad as the present oligopolistic status quo. And again, I really think that S&P and Moody's, their role in this whole problem has been overrated. They're as much the victims of the financial collapse as anybody else. The real problem is the business cycle, which is caused by the system of fractional reserve banking and fiat money and the central bank cartelization of the money supply. So if you want to look at the real heart of the problem, then the banking system and the central bank are the areas to really explore. Not to mention, of course, the role that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac played.
I mean, that's the system you're suggesting, right? You're suggesting that the market actually pay for the arbitrators of what they're doing, whether it's a bond rating agency or whether it's dispute resolution or whatnot. And I would posit to you that there's about a half a dozen ways in which that goes sideways. One is that they don't have a monopoly of force, therefore no one listens to them.
I think I've already dealt with this, but just quickly, if both parties are willing participants in the adjudication, you can have bond posting to settle the dispute. If you're bringing criminal to justice, then, well, you've brought them there by force, and the verdict can be carried out at the end of the sentence. A third option is when both you and the other party to the dispute have dispute resolution organizations sort of acting on your behalf, and then they'll have binding agreements on how that'll be handled with regards to adjudication. And presumably both dispute resolution organizations would be honor bound to ensure that the verdict was carried out, whatever it may be.
They're being paid by the people they're supposed to regulate, and they don't regulate properly because it's not in their financial interest to do so.
So bringing it back to the court system, Seder could just as well be arguing that the court is paid by one of the parties, so they're in the interest of ruling in favor of the court. But there would be a number of layers of abstraction to make sure this isn't the case. I mean, first of all, the court system, stock and trade, is the impartiality of their verdicts. So if a court has a reputation for siding with whoever brings the case, I guess it would be the plaintiff, then they would lose out on their desirability and their market share. But also with dispute resolutions, you have that layer of abstraction. So they might have like a contractual deal with a number of courts, paid on like a monthly fee or whatever, and not necessarily. I guess they're still paying them. Also, you're paying the court. You're not paying the judge. Of course, the court pays the judge. I think you would have a good deal of scrutiny attached to the judicial system, as we certainly have today under the statist system. So that would lead to a lot of pressure to ensure that things were fair and straight up. Unusual rulings would raise questions, potentially create disputes. A court that was routinely acting unfairly might get blacklisted by dispute resolution organizations, and so in their contractual dealings with other dispute resolution organizations, they would choose different courts based on their past experiences where their analysis was that the ruling was unfair. You could even have impartial third-party auditing services, sort of like Moody's, giving ratings to various court systems on the basis of their impartiality, the depth and breadth of the legal knowledge of the jurists involved, as well as the cost and the timeliness in which a verdict is rendered, whether the court provides any additional investigatory avenues, and even evaluating how credible their verdict is going to be to the general public. What if the court is blacklisted by any local dispute resolution organizations? So the crux of Seder's argument, to me, seems to be that the only way you can get this done is to have a state monopoly. And that's not true of agriculture or the production of vehicles or shoes or any other good or service. I don't see why it has to be the case for jurisprudence and justice as well.
Why couldn't it be that me, as an investor, I hire a completely independent rating agency to look at somebody's books before I make an investment?
Oh, you can have an auditor do that, and then I can have an auditor do that. But what if that company also? Well, excuse me. Let me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ancap has been cutting Seder off a fair bit, and he's sort of justified in. Like, he's had to talk over him a couple times. So I don't think Seder was out of line or anything here.
What agency would you? Let's just do hypothetical. ABC Accounting, right? Well, guess what, dude? I'm a company. You're just an investor. I hire ABC Accounting to do my books.
Wait, is this a ratings agency or an accountant firm? That would be called what we call a conflict of interest. And presumably the company would just inform you up front, oh, I'm sorry, we can't do this rating for you. We're a client of this company. Again, if it weren't for the SEC and the regulatory and licensure restrictions on credit agencies, then there probably would be more competition in this market than exists presently. So you wouldn't have just 2 or now 3 firms to choose from. And so any reputable professional is going to acknowledge the conflict of interest. If they're discovered not acknowledging that, as I don't think this relationship would be secret between them and the company, would it? If it wasn't, then they're running a pretty big risk just to provide you with inaccurate ratings, which again is another pretty big risk since, well, if they are a rating agency, I don't know why they're doing the books, but maybe they're a rating agency / accounting firm, and if their ratings are their primary stock in trade, then they're taking a pretty big risk by offering a bad service. That's how companies go broke. If they do a bad job, they alienate their potential customers, repeat clients, or don't divulge conflict of interest situations to prospective clients.
But why is ABC the only company? I mean, in a free market, there'd be ABC, there'd be DEF, there'd be GHI, there'd be JKL.
Do they have to disclose to you who their other clients are?
Professional ethics
if I want to be
dictates.
if they want my business, then they would be wise to disclose all
What
of
if
that.
they don't? What if? How would you know?
Sure, bad actors can exist, and that's true of the organization that you give a monopoly on violence to as well. In fact, bad actors seem to be driven to that particular organization, given its dominant role in society.
Now, the companies that want my business would be as open as possible. They would have open books and say, these are our clients.
I think this is a weak argument by the ancap. Basically, it's utopian thinking. Rather than assuming everybody's going to be a good actor, which I think overall is a fair assumption that most people would be good actors. I think that most people are decent and good, and that society couldn't function if that wasn't the case. But yeah, there can be bad actors, like with Enron, and that's true of whether there's a state or not, right? The accounting firm in the Enron situation, that's in a society with a government with regulatory rules and whatnot, and they hid the fraud, and these things can happen. Bad actors can happen, but they're rare.
We pay for it. Like, if they want my money as an investor, that's who I'm going to go with.
I got news for you. Me as a major corporation, I'm not going to hire ABC auditing if they're going to tell you who that they represent me. I'd like a little client privilege. I would like a little bit of.
Is going to be the one that to go to.
Yeah, I mean, and how do you know that they're actually? Are you saying they're?
Clearly, we need a rating agency to review rating agencies.
Mental law that they have to be transparent, or do you just guess that they're being?
I mean, that's basic professional ethics.
The market demands that they be transparent.
The market commands you. But actually, I think the ancap has a point. Maybe he's not expressing it as articulately as he could be. Companies that mistreat their clients are going to suffer in a market economy. Like, it seems like just from the company's perspective, the better thing would be to just tell you there's a conflict and not get involved. Also, like, I don't think consumers go to rating agencies, so I'm not sure how much this whole situation is representative of market processes. Not that there couldn't be conflicts of interest, in fact there were, and I think that Seder is sort of onto a valid point in line of argument here, but the way that credit agencies work with consumers is just by publishing data, not by being hired by consumers to evaluate. I mean, what are we really talking about here?
Is a market demand, then companies that want to make money.
What is the market? What do you mean the market?
Yeah, it's a bad expression. I think what he's saying is, like, you could say the market demands the companies produce goods at a higher quality or a lower price or some combination thereof that's desirable to consumers because of the force of competition and companies competing. They if they want to sell more products than the other guys and hence earn profits, then they're going to have to, at the very least, they have to match the competition, or at least come pretty close. So in that sense, you could say that this accounting / evaluation / rating / analysis hypothetical firm that we're contracting with, the market demands that they do a pretty good job, just like the market demands or competition between firms ensures that stores produce or factories produce pretty good goods. And part of that would be in the professional services, adhering to basic conflict of demand disclosure principles.
What does that mean? The market demand.
And I think this is a common theme in Seder's argument, is that bad actors can happen, ergo we need the state, which doesn't really seem compelling to me. What if the bad actors are in the state? Isn't the presence of bad actors really an argument against centralized authority and in favor of decentralization, in favor of processes that can weed out these bad actors? Isn't the mechanism of exchange in the market economy predicated upon voluntary consent, mutually beneficial relationships, exchange? Isn't that more inducive to eliminating bad actors than a system based upon revenue, based upon government monopoly and revenue obtained by coercion, as the first system, the market economy, has to be beneficial to every player, or they can simply withdraw their support. Whereas when you have one organization dictating to the other organizations, then that is not the case.
Market demand means that's what investors want. You're the market, I'm the market, everybody's the market. Combined, we become the market.
With our powers combined.
Market wants, meaning you, me, any investor wants to invest in a company, then you can pick
how does the market know that you're being... How does the market know that?
The market knows all.
What, go ahead.
How does the market, you, me, everybody, how do we know that? How do we know the company's telling us who all their clients are? They have no...
Again, he's just saying, what if there's a bad actor? The same ground we've been on for a while now.
Legal obligation to do so, correct?
Trust is huge. How do you know that when you buy a package from Amazon, it's going to come delivered to your house and they're not just going to keep the money? That's how they stay in business long term.
Well, it's also illegal for them to do that.
Yeah, but what are you going to do? You're going to go to the cops and say, Amazon didn't bring me my package? Are they gonna send a crack team of detectives to track it down, or are they going to tell you to get lost? The thing that keeps people in line, that keeps people respecting property rights, it's not really the state and the threat of jail, although these things exist and serve a purpose, delineating lines of acceptable conduct in society. But it's more just, people are overall pretty good. They just want to go about their day. They don't want to be predators and feed off anybody. And from a business perspective, you don't have a long-term viable strategy of screwing over your customers. They're not going to shop from you again. So sure, you can have sort of a high profit in the short term, but that's at expense of repeat transactions in the long term where you both benefit. I mean, look, Amazon didn't grow to be a billion-dollar corporation by screwing over their customers along the way. They've been acting in good faith, making these mutually beneficial exchanges along the way to become a billion-dollar corporation. What, in order so they can rug pull and scam me for a $50 purchase? It just doesn't make sense.
It's good for them to build up trust with the community and have their ratings actually be worth something and not dog shit like government ratings.
Right. So according to you, that companies never do stuff that, like, for instance, like, you would never see a situation where, I don't know, somebody says, hey, this new form of opioids is not addictive. Prescribe it.
Well,
I mean, if you want to talk about the opioid epidemic, let's talk about how prohibiting heroin use led to the recreational use of fentanyl and other more potent opioids.
Moron to believe it.
Do you know how many tens of thousands of people die each year now because they became addicted to that? Because
that question
the
back,
distribution.
do you have any idea how many morons die each year from self-inflicting, poison into their veins? Yeah,
Okay.
I'm well aware.
Are you aware? So, how many morons would you say make up our society?
How many morons?
Oh, a lot.
100,000 people died of drug overdose between 1999 and 2021 per year. Sorry. 100,000 died in 2021. I see, this is up from 20,000 from 1999. And the sharp increase is almost entirely due to synthetic opioids like fentanyl. So one could easily argue that banning heroin led to the proliferation of fentanyl. The people wanted the heroin high, they couldn't get it, they go for fentanyl instead. And because that's 50 times more potent, it's very dangerous and easy to get hooked on if they're putting it in with some other drug. And probably it's cost effective from the dealer's perspective, since you only need a tiny, tiny little bit to get high on. It's also apparently not as quality of a high, like you'd rather have heroin if you're into opioids, from what my research indicated anyway. Because there's something unique about heroin and maybe morphine in how it creates this feeling of euphoria, or how it interacts with the body. There's also been a sharp increase in overdose deaths involving stimulants such as cocaine and psychostimulants like PHP, increasing from just 12,000 per year in 2015 to 53,000 per year in 2021. This is the data I'm looking at. It's from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So the first chart, just overall overdose deaths. You see a very sharp increase. I mean, the absolute number is going to go up because of population, but we're talking a doubling in 5 years, whereas the total U.S. population growth is nothing like that, even with all the illegal immigrants. Now, figure 2, national drug involved overdose deaths, and then the lines, I don't know if you can see this here, but the lines are on the different drugs. So the first is synthetic opioids, other than methadone, so fentanyl and some other stuff. And then you've got psychostimulants with abuse potential, mostly meth. Then you have cocaine, and then prescription opioids, which I guess would be like Perks or Oxy. And then, of course, benzos, which used to be the most dangerous one. Now really taking a second seat, heroin and antidepressants. And you see, really starting in 2015, fentanyl just takes off here, just totally dominating the scene. And then meth is on the upswing too, and maybe there's some involvement there where dealers are giving like a drug cocktail with fentanyl and meth, or I don't know. I mean, I don't want to speculate actually. And here you have a chart showing any opioid, again, dramatic increase, presumably because of the fent. Now, here I think they're talking about oxys and those sort of like mid-level opioids, which, though increasing a little bit in popularity throughout the last 20 years, sort of leveling off because they're just not as dangerous as some other substances, would be my interpretation of this data. This is an interesting chart too, with the heroin, pretty steep increase in heroin deaths from almost a negligible amount in 2000 And then, so why did it increase so sharply? All heroin, probably this is when they started mixing in with the fent, and so the heroin was there, but it's so stepped on that nobody wants to buy it. So they put a little fent in there, and people start ODing because it's so potent. Oh yeah, you can see the secondary lines here. That yellow line is in combination with synthetic opioids. And note the distinguishing between synthetic opioids, basically fent, and prescription opioids, which was this chart here, prescription opioids. So the prescription opioids, and then showing also an increase in combination of deaths from prescription opioids in combination with synthetic opioids. So that would be the oxys, is the prescription opioids. And benzos here, still taking their share of lives. Again, the dramatic uptick in combination. And that's another thing, I guess, you can take home from this is any sort of combination much more dangerous than use on its own. Now, what Seder is talking about here is that opioids were promoted as a reasonable and safe method to treat pain. But again, this was in a society where we had a state, where we had a regulatory body, and the government didn't step in to stop the misinformation, at least not in time. Would this problem be any worse or better in a stateless society? I mean, people mess up. We make mistakes. We're human. I do think a big thing that's driving the synthetic opioids is the criminal status of heroin, which is probably a lot safer and a lot more benign than synthetic alternatives. Drugs like fentanyl are a lot easier to smuggle because it's so concentrated, and that's one of the things that prohibition does, is it encourages the use of more concentrated forms of substances. Of course, fentanyl probably has some use in medical facilities as well, so that's one way where dealers can get the supply. At the same time, leftists are pushing, at least in Canada, for a national pharmacare program. So how does that play into the whole opioid crisis when the government's going to start footing the bill for people's oxys? What's that going to do to the supply and the demand of prescription opioids, which are clearly, in my opinion, have the potential to be a entry-level drug or stepping stone? There's no question there's an opioid epidemic going on in Canada and in the United States. You look at cities like Portland or Vancouver, overrun with junkies, and to what degree is the welfare state subsidizing this? You know, these guys, they're not working 9 to 5s. They're out there boosting. They're spending. They're all on welfare. They're all spending their welfare checks on the fentanyl. And then you have government programs where they're giving them free drugs, you know, which they're doing in Vancouver. And I understand the incentive, the purpose is to reduce the amount of deaths, but really you are increasing the supply and exacerbating the problem in that manner. I don't think there's any easy solutions, and I don't think anybody should present like there are. Probably rehabilitation is our best bet. I do think this shouldn't be treated criminally. I think that it's more of a medical and a social issue, and you have to work on rehabilitation primarily, you know, get people clean, get them away from that lifestyle. Maybe relocation, you know, if you start a new life in a new city, maybe that's something that we need to look into. I don't think our current solutions are adequate, and I'm not going to tell you that I know how to solve the problem. I certainly don't. And I'm not sure I agree with the ancap's characterization of all these people as idiots. A lot of smart people can get hooked on, prescription drugs. They're popping a pill for pain, and the next thing they know, they're addicted. We should approach the situation with empathy, with compassion. Let's not demonize these people. Is the solution legalization and decriminalization? That's certainly the approach that I've always advocated, although I'm having second thoughts seeing what's happening in places like Portland and Vancouver where they're experimenting. I mean, is this helping the situation any? If you legalize it, that's going to create a big problem in that a fully legal market in these illegal drugs would see the price plummeting, and that could definitely see an increase in demand or quantity demanded. I mean, that's basic economics. That as the price drops, more you have more interested buyers, especially if you remove the stigma of criminalization. So I'm thinking maybe decriminalization is a good way to go. Make it illegal, give them a fine, and don't really care if they pay the fine, Don't throw them in jail, but, have maybe more widespread rehabilitation programs. They don't have to be run by the state. We can get, private charity involved here. We can have nonprofit organizations. I mean, a rehabilitation program doesn't have to be super expensive, It could be just in a house somewhere, a couple guys getting clean, semi-lockdown environment, a bed to sleep on, I think that there's been a huge waste in the war on drugs in terms of resources and man hours, both at the perspective of the policing resources invested in fighting this no-win war when they could have been directed towards dealing with violent criminals who are out victimizing people, even just responding to property crime, actual aggressors. And then there's the cost to our civil liberties that have come from the war on drugs. You saw incidents like that girl Brianna who was shot. There was some debate over whether it was a no-knock raid, and it was justifiable for the people who thought they were being housing invading to be shooting back, and then the police are shooting, and it's a whole mess. And the only reason they're in there is because of drugs in the first place. So we definitely have to critically evaluate our policies and move towards a more benign system that's focused on rehabilitation and less on punishment. I don't think full legalization is the way to go. I think that you do need to keep the cost extremely high just to disincentivize the marginal consumer. I think that we do want it technically prohibited just to express society's sort of evaluation that it's not a good idea. There's sort of a case for legalize and tax it at a very high rate. I mean, I don't know. Definitely, I'd like to take a look at if there are any examples of what various jurisdictions have tried and over a longer period of time to evaluate. I know that Portugal made some reforms. I know that Vancouver, the police won't even confiscate the drugs if they catch you with them, so long as it's a small amount, which is about as close to legalization as I think you'll find within a Western society at the moment.
But democracy is inherently immoral. Democracy is not rule. I don't want to be ruled by morals.
Absolutely, I agree. You know, during the 19th century, there was a great movement away from absolutism and away from the power of the state towards strictly limited state power. The state was exposed as the fraud that it was, and we had, the tremendous flourishing of social power and the diminishing of state power, which I really think has to be your goal, even if you're in favor of the state. I mean, who wants a strong government? That's just hard to defend, in my opinion. So, but when democracy came about in the 20th century, I mean, okay, there was democracy before the 20th century, but when democracy came about, what it did was it legitimized the state in the mind of the public. And now, as Seder says, the popular view is that we are the government. We control the government. It's serving us. And the reality is quite different. So I feel that democracy affords the illegitimate criminal state the appearance of legitimacy, when in reality it's still a criminal organization that is designed to loot the economic class and redistribute wealth to the political class. From my perspective, democracy is just a soft form of communism. I'm in favor of private property, individual rights. To the extent that the state should exist at all, it should be strictly limited in its purview to the defense of a person and their liberty and their property. This whole notion of the state as Santa Claus or Robin Hood or engaging in wealth redistribution, I completely oppose. And I think democracy is just a way for the majority or even a plurality of the population to force their will on the rest. What I like is the market economy, where the entire society is a voluntary society. Every exchange and interaction is consensual, it's non exploitative, it's not coerced. Everything is voluntary, and every interaction is mutually beneficial. People working in harmony towards their mutual ends, peaceful social cooperation. Whereas the state is, well, the institution, the organization of the political means. It's a tool of plunder and exploitation and subjugation and domination, where one class, the political class, can live parasitically off the economic class.
People shouldn't even be allowed to vote. That's why I'm an
Who
answer.
gets to choose who's the moron?
But you choose for yourself. I choose for myself. No, I don't choose for you. You don't let morons rule your life. You rule your own life.
So
I have a moron. I'm sorry, I'm going to say one thing. I don't normally do this anymore. But right now I have a moron and a chief moron enabler ruling my life.
Yo, who's this guy?
Well, there you go. I'm not going to defend Trump in this conversation.
I don't think that's what he meant.
Oh, well, if you're calling me a moron, there's not an argument, because you fail to realize that I can be a moron and completely correct. Maybe I am a moron, but that doesn't make me wrong. If you want to tell me why I'm wrong, you have to make an actual argument.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, you may be
This guy's good. This caller is good.
at the vast majority of people in our society are morons, and
I mean, strictly speaking, moron's a clinical term. It means like 70 IQ, and it's a pretty low percentage of the population. Although colloquially, it just means idiot.
it's okay that by nature of them being morons, that they should be subject to things like addictive substances that end up killing them because they're
prescribed by their doctor.
that are prescribed by their doctor,
Otherwise,
by their doctor,
What does the opioid crisis have to do with democracy or organizing society through the marketplace versus the state? That's just a total red herring.
They're subjecting themselves to it.
So how?
What's the argument that if we had a government, there wouldn't be opioids? We have a government.
Have you ever do you have a disease? Have you ever had to go and rely on a doctor for serious medical advice?
No, I take good care of myself. I don't
How
have
old are you?
I'm not being
How old are you?
I'm jogging. I exercise.
How old are you?
My healthcare costs are effectively zero.
How old are you?
I'm 32.
Okay. Now I got some bad news for you, Chief. As someone who's about 20 some odd years older than you are, it's coming, and you're gonna go to your doctor, whether it's for whatever it is. Like, I mean,
The vast majority of healthcare costs are preventable. The leading cause of death in America is heart disease. It's perfectly preventable. I go jogging. I'm not going to have heart disease.
Okay.
So what am I going to suffer from when I get older?
Great. You're not going to have heart disease. Congratulations.
Why do you put me in a position like, yes, exercise and diet are very good and very important, and we should create a social system where everybody, including people like yourself, morons, can access those things. But, dude, you are not going to live. You're not going to be immortal because you eat a carrot. You know that, right?
Certainly. But I can
certainly,
extend
all right.
my life and the quality of it.
So,
Yeah,
but I
you
think with
can,
Sam,
unless you have a genetic predisposition to cancer,
right?
And something like that. Now, presumably, let's just work. I got a little hypothetical for you. You have cancer. You have cancer because you are genetically predisposed now to cancer, and you go in to see your doctor, and your doctor says, I suggest that you do X, Y, or Z, and you say, well, I'm not a moron, I'm going to get a second opinion. And that doctor says, you should do TWX. And so you're like, well, they both said X. Do you really have the ability to assess, though, what's happening? I mean...
No, I don't have medical training. I would go with whichever one seemed more credible.
Across the country who are prescribing this for this medication for stuff that ultimately we found that they shouldn't. That the corporation absolutely knew was an addictive, far more addictive substance than they were suggesting to the doctors.
I mean, this is the perfect example of what I was talking about earlier, which is something happens and then the state extorts companies for money. So, for example, Kentucky versus Purdue Pharma, they had to pay $24 million because their drug turned out to be addictive, and they reaped unjust enrichment. Johnson & Johnson had to pay $500 million because they sold opioids. The reality is that there's a lot more blame that should be attached to the policies of the federal government than to companies which are simply reacting to a demand in the marketplace. When narcotics were criminalized in 1914, you end up with a marketplace where the quality is quite uncertain, and that's one of the causes of overdose is the user never knows how pure a particular batch is, so they're trying to figure out how much of a dose to take, and they can end up doing too much or not enough. And another tendency under prohibition is to seek more concentrated products like hashish instead of marijuana. During alcohol prohibition, gin and whiskey became more popular than beer and wine, since it's easier to sneak around a bottle of whiskey than a keg of beer. During the 80s, when the war on drugs was really stepped up, smugglers started to prefer cocaine to marijuana because marijuana is very bulky and has a strong odor, so it's harder to conceal than the much more valuable and more difficult to detect cocaine. Another less explored aspect of government policy that's to blame is the treatment of soldiers and suffering post-traumatic stress disorder from serving in wars like Iraq and Afghanistan. They come home, they've got these issues. You saw it with Vietnam vets. We're seeing it today with soldiers coming home from the Middle East. And, you know, a lot of the time they're just sort of left on their own to fend for themselves. And a lot of them do turn to illegal drugs as sort of a means of self-medicating. Now, Sam Seder is definitely correct that a big part of the opioid epidemic is people got hooked. They weren't trying to do anything wrong. They weren't out on a street corner, you know, trying to score. They got pain problems, and so they took pain medicine, and they got hooked that way. And yeah, probably there is some blame, some fraud, I would say, on the part of Big Pharma, Johnson & Johnson, other companies that promoted these drugs as safe. But I don't think that's a valid argument in the broader context of government planning versus the market economy, because they did this under a regime of regulation, in a society where there was a state. So I don't see how that's an argument against statelessness. The regulatory framework was in place. Big government was there, and big government failed to identify the risk as well. It could have been a good faith error on the part of the companies also. I mean, I don't want to attribute to malice what can be thought of as incompetence. Maybe they truly believed that their product was safe. Addiction's a poorly understood realm of human action in the first place. People do have free will. People make choices. So placing all the blame on the hands of the substance or the company or the drug dealer, I think, is mistaken. Individuals have agency, but I really do think that prohibition greatly exacerbated this situation and led to the proliferation, especially of the dangerous fentanyl.
Research. We had an FDA that was not that is not equipped and should be strengthened, and we should have stronger laws. We had we had a regulatory system which obligated the distributors of these drugs to
Could well be that the FDA failed to do its job as a regulatory agency, and perhaps that's part of the problem with a government monopoly on oversight and regulation, that if the state had not given itself this monopoly on oversight, maybe there could have been competing firms that were offering a more critical assessment of products that were brought to market that could have caught this problem. I'm not a utopian. I don't want to suggest that a libertarian society would be utopia. Maybe the problem would be just as bad or worse. Nobody really knows for sure. I don't want to engage in idle speculation. I'd prefer to stick to the world of facts and what we can prove and what we can know.
On spikes that they see in the way that this was being prescribed, but because corporations have cut away and eat away and people are against government,
People are against government? I mean, get real, Sam. That's not the world we live in today. The highly regulated government spending is, in my country, 50% of GDP. It's a little less in the States, sure, but you also have a much stronger economy. There is so much government. There is so much faith in government. That's a big part of the problem.
I'm not done.
No, Sam, you are done. I call the shots.